As somebody born in the late 80s, the genre of game I had my earliest experiences with were 2D platformers. Naturally, this largely stemmed from my childhood and my first introduction to computer games in the early 90s. My experience is that there were two types of gamer kid in those days: Nintendo gamers and Sega gamers. In a way, not much has changed, I suppose. Anyway, I was very much the latter, and as such, my video game genesis is a carefully balanced diet of almost exclusively 2D platformers. As a child, I owned a grand total of 5 Mega Drive cartridges: Sonic 1, Aladdin, The Lion King, Captain Planet, and Echo the Dolphin. It's not until I've actually sat down to write this script that I've realised, with the exception of Echo the Dolphin, which is an arguable contender for most nerve-shredding game of all time, fight me in the comments, all of those games are 2D platformers. Saying this out loud, it feels almost painfully obvious, and yet the handling and feel of these 4 games are vastly different. In my opinion, the best of these is Sonic 1, a game I still have a great passion for and occasionally speedrun, albeit quite badly. The most sharpened childhood memories I have of this game, aside from the easily memorable cheat code and my mum taking perhaps just a little bit too much satisfaction in watching Sonic drown in Labyrinth Zone, are the colourful visuals, the catchy 8-bit music, and the memorable and visually distinctive badniks. Maybe I'm looking back with rose-tinted glasses, or perhaps I just spent way too much time playing it in my youth, but I've always felt that Sonic is a much easier game than its Italian cousin Super Mario Bros. On the NES. This might also have something to do with the fact I could only play Super Mario Bros. At the cost of 20p a time on the arcade machine at my dad's local pub, but whatever. Bearing all this in mind, I wanted to create a new 2D platformer that had the visual and audio style of Sonic the Hedgehog, but had the unforgiving difficulty curve of Super Mario Bros. And from that, the marvellous adventures of Marvin Starr was born. You can download it now from itch.io, link in the description, etc, etc. Whilst combining those core elements of Sonic and Mario into a new experience might be a laudable goal in and of itself, it felt a little too basic. There are literally thousands of 2D platformers on the itch.io store alone, with a huge variety of graphics, aesthetics, themes, and levels of finesse, and it just felt a bit pointless to throw another game into this already saturated market for the sake of it, especially one that I wasn't going to be spending more than a few weeks developing. I needed something else to make my game a little different from all the others. To this end, I came up with a mechanic which, whilst I'm pretty sure isn't unique or brand new, felt different enough to raise this game to something more than an absolutely bog-standard 2D platformer. After a few experiments, I came up with the idea of cloning the player character to create new platforms, which could be used to reach otherwise inaccessible areas. I think I might have been peripherally inspired by Thomas Was Alone, a game I haven't played more than a few levels of, but feel now would probably be a good time for me to go and revisit. The introduction of this mechanic meant that it became something of a simple puzzle game, as well as a 2D platformer. After I took the decision to limit the number of clones you could create on a single level, it also took on an element of resource management. I'll say at this point, I don't feel that I fully explored the cloning mechanic to its full potential, and I honestly think that some of the puzzles where you're required to use it could have been a bit more thought out. But time makes fools of us all, as the saying goes. More on world building and level design a bit later on. The first and most salient problem I had to contend with was one I've struggled with all my life. I am the worst artist in the entire world. There are amoeba on Saturn who can draw more convincing looking characters than I can. And whilst I am, broadly speaking, an artistic person, my day job is as a musician after all, the more high school definition of the word art is never one that I've had any affinity for. Unlike my wife, who is a fantastic artist, and you should definitely check out more of her stuff when we finally get round to setting up her website. Anyway, given I wanted to create an eye-catching and visually attractive game, how was I going to get around the issue of making a protagonist and enemies that are memorable whilst having less than no talent in the drawing department? Well, to be honest, in the first instance I ignored this problem altogether and started with Unity standard 2D sprites painted in different colours. Using basic shapes certainly seemed to work for Thomas Was alone, but I knew in the long run I was going to have to come up with a better solution. I considered leaning heavily on resources in the Unity Asset Store or from opengameart.org, but that felt a bit cheap and slightly counter to what I was trying to achieve. It was around this time that I discovered Paint 3D, a terrible piece of free software with slightly more power than MS Paint. I've since discovered I probably should have been using Paint.net, but we live and learn. As it turns out, Paint 3D has a load of ready-to-use shapes which require the gargantuan task of clicking and dragging to create, something that even an artistic troglodyte like me could manage. The character started out looking like this, which earned him the moniker Mr. Blob. Fun fact, the original working title was Death Becomes You, based off the idea that you killed yourself and created a clone in order to continue your journey. It didn't take me long to realise that this was a wholly inappropriate title for a colourful, adventurous 2D platformer in the style of Sonic the Hedgehog, and the title was quickly changed to The Many Adventures of Mr. Blob, a title that stuck right up until the game was nearly finished, when it again changed to more accurately reflect the final character design. Second fun fact, the collectible pellets have a little B written on them, as they were originally going to be styled as blob pellets. It wouldn't take me a massive amount of time to change them now, but I kind of like the idea of there being a developmental story or Easter egg behind this random letter B. Anyway, after a bit of fiddling, this was the final character design I settled on. Mr. Starr felt a bit too generic, but Marvin Starr had a sort of ring about it. The second R is pure pretentiousness. If the problem of not being able to draw was a first setback, the problem of not being able to create convincing-looking animations was that problem squared. In truth, it's not really a problem I managed to overcome. The animations in the game could probably be described as cute if you were feeling generous, or earth-shatteringly hellish if you're not. Okay, the animations on the flying enemies are passable, but Marvin Starr himself is pretty shoddy. I'm going to chalk this up to the limitations of using Paint 3D to create the initial sprite. Moving individual pixels about is a horribly fiddly task. Moreover, it was also my first time creating 2D pixel art. In the end, I decided to settle for moving the feet in a small circle for the walking and running animation, and a simple rotating sprite with a slightly more serious face for the jump animation. It's not Sonic the Hedgehog by any stretch of the imagination, but the rotating character a la Sonic felt like a more natural way for the character to look when jumping, rather than the arms up Mario equivalent. All that having been said, I'm quite happy with the way the idle animation turned out. Slightly ironic that that one was by far the easiest to make, yet also looks the most natural. I'm sure there's a lesson to be learned there. My time spent in 3D worlds has possibly had the effect of causing me to overthink what should be relatively simple problems. Either that, or there are just significantly more 3D assets that are readily available, so I can offload most of the fiddly work onto other people. As to the worlds themselves, I wanted them to have a distinct look and character, and have almost slavishly stuck to the tried and tested Sonic method of luscious green hill level, industrial or factory level, and level with fire. I've also included a wooded nighttime world, and even that can be found within the early Sonic canon, though is admittedly slightly less typical. Full disclaimer, I did end up using publicly available art for the parallax backgrounds and the trees in the mountain gardens world. A brief attempt at trying to create my own backgrounds proved very quickly that this was going to be beyond my skill set in the given time frame. Oh, the parallax backgrounds, that's a cool thing I found out about. So, in very early platformers like Mario, the background tends to be a solid colour with individual sprites dotted around, like clouds or bushes to add some detail. But even as early as the first Sonic game, parallax backgrounds are used to give a sense of depth to the world. In short, objects that are supposed to be furthest in the background are either static or scroll very slowly, whereas objects that are supposed to be closer scroll faster. In Marvin Starr, the background is actually 4 separate layers which all move at different speeds. This is something I wouldn't even have thought about, and frankly, wouldn't even have realised was a thing had I not inadvertently stumbled upon it whilst looking up various YouTube tutorials. Briefly under the bonnet then, 3 of each of the background layers are attached to the camera, 1 centred, and then 1 each on the left and the right. The The different layers are set to scroll at slightly different speeds and then snap back to the centre when the player has travelled a certain distance. The parallax effect can be very subtle, but it's certainly noticeable when it's not there. The original goal was to have 25 levels across 5 different worlds. I decided to stop after 4 worlds, mainly because of time constraints, but also because I felt like I wasn't bringing anything new to the levels and that old chestnut of creativity running dry was starting to rear its head. Procrastination was getting harder and harder to stave off. This wasn't helped by the fact that in the middle of March I suddenly found myself with a lot more free time than anticipated. It's a very strange phenomenon, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who gets it, but when I have a large chunk of time available, I find I'm significantly less productive than if I have, say, a spare hour. The levels were taking longer and longer to design, and not just because they were bigger and more complex, but because I'd keep alt-tabbing to check Discord or Twitter every 3 to 5 minutes. And although the levels that introduce new features or new enemies would be slightly easier to design, a tutorial level of sorts, the rest seemed to take exponentially longer the more levels I had. Part of this is also probably down to the process of beginning a new level from scratch. I had some templates in place to make the process a little less arduous, but not enough to make the feeling of starting a new level any less tedious. I got around this by interspersing level design with touching up bits of art or rewriting bits of code, which presumably uses a different creative part of the brain. I think if I get stuck doing one thing for too long, the net result is never as good as when I'm doing a task fresh. I did, however, manage to stave off doing elements like the menu, credits and sound effects until after the level design process was fully completed, which is almost certainly a good thing. My feeling is that these are concrete examples of things that should be treated as a totally separate section of the design process. Experience has taught me that unless it's an inherent part of the puzzle, sound and music in particular isn't something that should be mixed up with the nuts and bolts of designing the game or the levels. Which is a shame in a way, because music and sound effects on a game like this are the things that really make it feel alive. I chose some quirky 8-bit tracks to go with the levels to really add to the retro flavour of the game, and some inoffensive but hopefully charming sound effects to give some further audial interest. The last thing I designed was the menu screen. In full releases I've done in the past, I've made a big deal about having custom settings and options that the player can toggle. For this project, however, it didn't really feel in character with the retro style, so the options are pretty non-existent. I did add a time trial mode for speedrunners. This also functions as a practice mode for working on those pinch points in some of the later levels. Naturally, you don't unlock the time trial mode until you've reached the equivalent level in the full game mode. There's also an overall internal speedrun clock, which displays your best time on the main menu screen for those die-hard 2D platform runners who sink hours of grinding into levels in an effort to shave off just one more second. The menu navigation is the only really interesting thing to report on from a programming point of view. Usually, I'll just use UI buttons and let the player click where they want to navigate to on the menu, but much like with Daedalus, I really wanted to get away from having to use the mouse at all. Unlike with Daedalus, however, the approach isn't through typing instructions, but through navigating the menus with the arrow keys. This was very much a new concept to me, and took a little bit of rewiring of old habits to figure out. In its most basic form, each page of the menu is contained within a different object and can be activated or deactivated as required. However, the options themselves are slightly different. They're simple UI text mesh objects with an animator component attached to do the bouncy text thing. Except, instead of activating the animator on a mouse hover, each selectable title in each menu page is assigned a number. Pressing up or down on the keyboard changes the number and therefore which option is animating and selected. Pressing enter performs the action for the selected option. It's a little primitive, but again gives it that nice retro feel and takes the mouse totally out of the equation. The full screen option is there purely because it looks so pretty in full screen mode, but the initial plan was to have it locked to a window. Owing to how the game has been designed and how the camera tracks the player, I decided early on that I was going to lock the resolution to 1024 by 768. The 4:3 ratio was important for the levels to not have an empty space at either end, and the 1024 by 768 was important to ensure all of the text looked consistent with how it had been when it was designed. Consequently, if you're playing on a monitor from this decade, full screen mode will most likely have a pair of black lines down the sides. It's not a game killer, and again plays into the retro look, but that is certainly something I'd want to change if I was going to spend a bit more time with this project. Finessing builds to work on different size monitors or even on different operating systems is a grade A nightmare and not something I particularly wanted to pursue during this project. Other things I'd want to develop further? Well, I've already mentioned the USP cloning mechanic. At present, it's a neat gimmick, but it would be nice to have it be a more integral part of the game design rather than just in a superficial capacity. My colleague Alex actually suggested I should change the way the clone is spawned to make it look more natural, but a quick experiment demonstrated I'd have to do quite a lot of rewriting of the base code. As a result, the original idea is the one that's in the game. From a technical point of view, when you clone your character, the original player sprite is locked and turns black, and a brand new instance of the player is spawned directly above the clone. Whilst it looks fairly natural when standing still, it looks a bit strange when jumping horizontally, and admittedly did look better when I tried it the other way round, that is, keeping the player movement constant and spawning a clone underneath. Aside from the substantial rewrite, however, it would also have required a handful of the puzzles to be rethought, which all added up to more time than I was prepared to throw at it. All that having been said, I think the game functions very nicely. I certainly had a lot of fun playing it in testing, and it feels relatively robust. If nothing else, it offers significantly more replayability than Daedalus, and I think that's got to count for something. And so we press on to game number 3. I must confess, I've written down a big list of ideas for games. I thought that was probably a good plan rather than completing a game and having nothing to jump into. The thing I've decided to do next pays homage to one of my favourite games of the last 10 years. It's almost certainly the game I've sunk the most amount of time into outside of Skyrim. I'm talking about the competitive espionage game Spy Party. Spy Party isn't really the sort of game that one can sum up in one sentence, so I'd recommend you go and check out the trailer. What I can say is that Project Number 3 is going to be a multiplayer exclusive game. Given the current global climate and the state-mandated lockdown affecting a quarter of the world's population, more people are turning to other forms of social interaction at the moment, specifically either online interaction or more meaningful interaction with the people in their household. And whilst I have already built a few games that are played on Twitch, this one is going to focus on the traditional multiplayer style of huddle round the monitor gaming. If I pull off what I've got in mind, it's also going to question a very different part of the meta around local multiplayer games. In an ideal world, this would probably be an online game as well, and all of the previous sentence is basically an excuse for the fact that I almost certainly don't have the skill set to pull off a fully networked multiplayer game. But I don't want to bite off more than I can chew, so this seems like the safest option. I guess that covers everything for this episode then. Have fun with the marvellous adventures of Marvin Starr, let me know in the comments what you think, and I'll see you in a month.